Hey y'all, why did the Irish create pommels this way? Because it looked cool. That's why so many things were made the way they were made. Because they looked cool. They were fashionable. People thought it looked cool. And of course, the pommel has a practical function of counterbalancing the weight of the blade on the sword and some other things in terms of how you can grab it and how you can use the pommel itself as a weapon. But the reason for this specific pommel design is because they thought it looked cool. And to me, we underestimate the importance of fashion and culture in the context of how we judge historical items. You know, like look at the Cinque Dea, the super famous extra wide blades from Renaissance times, especially in Italy. And, you know, these were kind of inspired by a renewed interest in Greek and Roman classical history and the types of swords that were used back then. And so they're creating these short, extra wide blades. And of course, some of them get fairly long. But anyway, there's no practical reason to really make a blade with complex fullers and to create that specific design. There are plenty of other designs that are probably far easier to produce and far more practical. The reason to make a Cinque Dea is swag. It's got that drip. It looks cool. Okay? And even some things that we define as practical, like, you know, specific blade typologies and shapes, while there might be a practical theory behind using that blade shape, you know, how practical that worked out in reality versus what the theory was, you know, is something to consider. And also, you know, did that style of blade catch on because, you know, Count Puppenheimer, who's this super famous and super stylish and well-regarded, you know, aristocrat, was fond of it, and everybody saw his fancy sword and wanted a sword like his. You know, the same thing with armor and clothing, everything, but there's a certain element of fashion to this, and when people tend to look at the evolution of sword blades and sword hilts in this very sort of practical, pragmatic way, as if it's this kind of evolution in the survival of blades is based, you know, purely on this engineering problem of how they're being used on the battlefield. And that's certainly an important consideration for that. I'm not denying that or denying the importance of that at all. But people are not rational. People are emotional. People are easily swayed and influenced by other people and fashion and culture, and that's how people work. So you can't ever underestimate that in how people make and design things and why people choose one thing over another thing. It's not always going to be practical considerations. It's going to be cultural and fashion considerations as part of that. And you really have to consider that carefully. You know, people look at this from like a historical, academic, archaeological kind of thing and think, you know, well, what's the practical reason for that? And then they go, well, you know, what is the religious significance of that? What is the spiritual or symbolic significance of that? And things may have those kinds of significance, but they also just look cool. So never underestimate the power of something looking cool in terms of why it was chosen in a certain time period. I mean, and it's easy to look back on things and wonder about stuff like that. But, you know, think about modern fashion choices and things that modern people choose. And some of them, you know, are kind of objectively ridiculous. But, you know, that's the whole point. People think it looks cool. Some people think a permed mullet looks cool. You know, me, not so much. So, you know, it's that kind of thing. So something to consider when you're thinking about the historical context of various objects. Y'all have a good day.